I'll be here and okay, so take a break or whatever. I don't know how.
But I have
Yeah. You'll have it on once you start. Yeah.
What's this for? So for people who aren't mic'd, so like I'm only going to speak for 5 minutes, but make sure you turn around, right? Oh, I will. When I turn it off, yeah. When I start and then Mary who comes after me will speak and then I'll turn it off. I'm going to speak from here, right? You want me to speak from here? Oh yeah, but that's your mic. Makes it easier. Yes, please. Yeah.
Is Raphael here today?
No, he's on vacation.
I've been tweeting stuff out, bits and pieces.
But they just did the Fox thing. Did they?
Yeah.
I told Josh to help me come up with the professional Twitter account and Facebook account.
What do you mean?
An enterprise, yes, just the basic.
We can't do just one for the market.
Just the one. No. Like a professional, it's kind of the same enterprise.
Hang on.
It's just going to be a professional Twitter facing for me. It's going to be
Oh, for you,
my personal.
Oh, that I like that.
One, but I want a professional one. And I will ask him to help me know what to do. And I can get him to help. I'll control it when I need to do something. Because Ben Winter sent me something. It's like people are tagging you on social media right now. Where are you? Where are you? So I got a text from him. And it was a picture. Like, where are you? You need a Twitter. You'll be killing it out here on Twitter right now.
I've got 3 Twitters.
So I need a professional, my enterprise picture, draft and wire, just that basic thing. I don't acknowledge that. I just, you know what, even though I'm being kind of pushed out publicly, I'm not necessarily working, you know what I mean? It's just, I'm comfortable in it, but I don't necessarily need to do false things that are not me. This is me. So supervisor, I can never want to say, I'm going to push you off there all the time. He said it'll start showing maybe tonight, like they'll start advertising.
Oh, yeah. I was reading our
I'm gonna have her
Just skip it.
Probably.
Because I want to all speak to it. No, she did that.
Like somebody was there.
Can you make sure now? Is Alan going to this process? It's good for him to do.
Yeah. Private stuff.
So, Southern California grad makers, Southern California grad makers can be on camera.
No way. That's why I just
So you'll be on camera, and I'm trying to figure out about other ones. So it'll be me, you, Effie, me, and Fred.
And then all the
That'll work. There'll be some different, like, I know I have to figure out the questions yet. And Greg came back and said, no, I didn't.
I know, right?
Maybe. Because I I was proposing.
I'm still laughing when I look at your name.
That the foundation to say like where they are, how they're activating things. And I think that they're putting it back on us and saying like, what are you doing? Supporting the research, but indigenous groups getting resources so they can deliver engaging churches. That's what for the sermon to come.
Yeah, well, this is going to be live stream. Please engage. I'm not sure which platform it's going through. He wasn't sure yet because he's having some technical problems.
How's he doing now?
He is almost okay. He's a little stressed. But we finally got that fixed. But in terms of like, the sound was an issue. So, I'm also, when I talk about reports recommendations, I'm going to use conditioner and also expand over extension. Hello? Hi, everybody. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. If you could take a seat, please. If you could take a seat.
We can't really hear it.
Yeah, can't really hear it. All right, people, I think we're live. Hi, good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
No. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. All right. My name is Ramon Mendez. I'm the Director of Solutions at Enterprise Community Partners. Can everybody in the back hear me? Yes? Okay. So I'd like to, on behalf of Enterprise Community Partners and the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing, we would like to welcome you to our afternoon with Richard Rothstein, author of The Color of Law. So just to let you know, I was talking to him earlier and I was like, Mr. Rothstein. He goes, I don't know who that is, it's Richard. So just know, Richard is here with us today. We are, just a few things.
He was saying something.
What's that? Oh. So just a few logistical things. Please engage with us today with our hashtags, hashtag Color of Law, hashtag Undesigned the Red Line. Please use your social media. This is also being YouTube live. So there are people out there. For those of you out in our virtual audience, welcome. For those of you who are here, if you haven't figured out, the restrooms are out the building and to the left and back in the building. And please enjoy the refreshments that we have here. As many of you know, and we will learn more today, federal, state, and local governments, along with the building and lending industries, have historically adopted and enforced practices leading to geographic, economic, legal, and political racism. Redlining is a practice sponsored by the federal government in the 1930s, where maps were created to indicate the level of risk for mortgage investments. Redlining transitioned blacks from blatant Jim Crow era racism to geographical structural racism and led to a widespread racial segregation that has a residual effect in Los Angeles and across the country. For example, and I think a lot of us have heard the recent studies, that the racial disparity in wealth between whites and blacks, mostly created by home ownership opportunities, would take 228 years to close. 228 years to close the racial disparity between black and white people. This other one that we keep hearing is about the zip code. The zip code that you live in can determine your life outcomes, your quality of education, how successful you live, how healthy you will be, and how long you will live. And here in Los Angeles, while blacks represent only 9% of the county's population, more than 1/3 of its population experiences homelessness. Again,
9% of the county population, yet they represent 1/3 of the population experiencing homelessness. We ask ourselves, how did we end up with so many people who are poor, lacking opportunity, or experiencing homelessness? And we are now understanding that it is a system of larger systems failure, like redlining, that we have been looping for decades and must be undesigned in both principle and practice. At Enterprise, we believe that hope begins with housing and access to opportunity, quality and good paying jobs, education and health. We are engaging with our private and public partners to educate and act on solutions, and every step counts. For example, across markets, and just this month, we launched the Undesigned Redline exhibit, which I hope a lot of you got to visit before coming today. If not, it is here through March 31st. Please bring your friends, bring your families, engage with the exhibit, and try to understand where you as an individual, personally, and youth professionally, can help undesign the red line. This exhibit is important to us. It was launched in collaboration with the Los Angeles Trade Tech Center, our host today, the host of the exhibit, Mark Ridley Thomas's office of the 2nd Supervisorial District, and Undesign the We, which is the organization that has put these exhibits across the nation. The purpose is that for us to have a deeper understanding of where we've been and what will it take to drive community change. With the exhibit's launch, we hosted a day-long symposium to not only learn the history of redlining in Los Angeles, but engage partners, including housing, education, job creation, health, the public sector, community partners, to learn how they are exploring and driving solutions to undo the impact of redlining. Finally, just this Monday, the county presented its ad hoc committee report and recommendations on Black people experiencing homelessness, the first of its kind nationwide. To guide its work, the ad hoc committee adopted the use of Racial Equity Toolkit, a process that set of questions designed to guide, inform, and assess how policies, programs, and budgetary decisions burden and/or benefit Black people experiencing homelessness. The report puts forth 67 recommendations across the various public systems, including housing, the criminal justice system, foster care, and is based on the lived experience of homeless Black people. I want to introduce Suzette Shaw, who, and she's shy, because on Monday she would not stand up. I just want to acknowledge she is a committee member that created this report, and also Commissioner Jacqueline Wagner, who co-led this report. But there's also smaller steps that we can take individually. For example, locally in our office, we started a book club. And to no surprise, one of the first books that we selected was The Color of Law. And so we've read it last year and we thought this is great. But given with all these new reports, with the exhibit, with the opportunities to really, where it's synchronizing on how to think to undo the historical barriers, we're reading it again. And I'm not saying that just because Richard's here in the room, but it's because it is such a broad perspective to then really dive in deeply into Los Angeles, like the exhibit does, and say, again, where have we been? How do we undo the barriers? So just for the program this afternoon, I would like to welcome you again. We're going to have a brief explanation of the Undesigned exhibit, in case you missed Mary's guided tours. Then Mr. Rothstein will do his Richard. Richard will do his presentation, and we have a few surprises, and then finally, then we'll have a conversation, and then the book signing afterwards. So with that, I would like to introduce Mary Lee. So Mary, to the podium. She is our consultant, but those of you who don't know Mary Lee, and there should be very few people in this room, she is the former Deputy Director of Policy Link, a national advocacy organization working to advance racial equity and social justice. But the amount of wealth, the wealth of experience, knowledge, and commitment that Mary has made this experience with the Undesigned and activities phenomenal. So,
Thank you so much. For a second, I thought Ramon was. Yes, I am. That's absolutely right. I claim it. My lead because I thought for a second that Ramon was going to say that I was wealthy, and I'm not. Probably because of the historical implications and impacts of redlining and restrictive covenants and all the things that Richard so effectively writes about in his book. So I'm delighted to be here today, and so happy that some of you have had a chance to visit the Undesigned, the Redline exhibit. And I have to again acknowledge the sponsorship of Enterprise Community Partners, of the Office of LA County Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas, and Trade Tech, which is represented by its august president in the back of the room. But we really, just from that partnership, you can see how important this exhibit is to Los Angeles, and I really commend to those of you that haven't had a chance to visit it, that you do so, and that you also take your friends and your family and block club members and classmates and workmates, folks from your faith communities, whatever groupings you have, because as you're going to hear in the discussion that's going to follow this, we have the aftermath of an intractable system that has shaped our lives, whether we knew it or not, and continues to do so in every single aspect of our lives. And the Undesigned, the Redline exhibit, is an effort to begin a dialogue to broaden understanding of what that is, and more importantly, what we can do about it, what we must do about it. I want to credit again Designing the We, which is a social impact design studio in New York City, which conceptualized this particular iteration of an explanation of redlining. But be sure and be clear, lots of people have talked about it, lots of people have written about it, and there's a lot of information and videos and maps. In fact, the LA maps and other maps from other parts of the country are available interactively in other places. But what Designing the We has done is to take forward what they try to do in the work that they do anyway, which is to really focus on how there can be community-driven and social-focused discussions on the cultural and economic development opportunities that can be changed with collaboration, particularly collaboration with the people who live in the communities that have been so affected. And in the course of doing their work, and they do a lot of other kinds of things, Designing the We wanted to identify opportunities to work collaboratively on co-design strategies that could challenge some of these intractable barriers in our society, and redlining was one of the ones that came to the surface. So the Undesigned Project is this interactive exhibit. It starts with the maps, the historical maps that you may or may not know existed dating back to the 1930s, when the federal government first began, well, I don't know if it was first began, but began again to cut up our country using race and color and creed as a way to divide us. And what we see in redlining is, frankly, the embodiment of racialized attitudes. Racism is more than just a belief and a preference or a opinion. Racism is coupled with power to literally define the quality of someone's life, as Ramon indicated, the length of your life, your opportunities, where you live, where you go to school, what kind of job you have. Things like the built environment, what our communities look like, whether they have parks or grocery stores, whether transportation is convenient and affordable and accessible and gets us where we need to go. All of these things and more are shaped by where we are and where we are in our places. And throughout the history of this country, people of color have been pushed and pulled and located and displaced and dispersed throughout this nation. And redlining is one of the methods that perpetuated and perpetrated that type of behavior, and it's still with us. So we have a lot to do to undesign it. The exhibit provokes our understanding. It uses an example of a map from New York, but then quickly shows you a map of Los Angeles region that dates back many decades. And it's interactive because we want to see where you are on that map today. It also invites us to think about some of the historic events and activities that occurred in Los Angeles that have roots in those racialized attitudes. Things like the Supreme Court case that challenged restrictive covenants, that one of the members of the legal team, Lauren Miller, an African-American attorney from Los Angeles, is talked about in the exhibit. It also talks about some of the horrific examples of displacement that were racialized, including the confiscation of properties of Japanese Americans during World War II, both businesses and homes confiscated. It talks about other instances of pushing and pulling people off of their places, but it invites us to tell more stories because we recognize that there's no way that any one exhibit could know all that we know and our ancestors know, our family members know. So it invites you to list some of those. It includes a timeline to show what else was happening in our history, the history of our nation during this period of time, and moving all the way forward to today. And not just a timeline of the types of policies that confined us based on race, but of the social movements and advocacy efforts that have challenged things like mass incarceration or racialized decisions that have affected us in terms of our environment and climate justice. And then the very final component, which is perhaps the most important concept that is put through the Undesigned Project, and that is the undesigned aspect of it. Redlining is a policy, it's a practice, it's a system that's been incorporated too much into the ways in which we live, but we can undesign it. And so the last segment of the exhibit seeks to get us thinking about that. What will it take for us to be able to think through a different way for us to utilize our economic system so that it serves everybody in an inclusive way, so that it begins to address things like the wealth gap and begins to address things like educational disparities and health disparities. And we know that we're not going to get instantaneous ideas from people, but we want to get you thinking about how to plug into organizations. Some of you work in housing and in related fields. We want to get you thinking about how you can do your work differently and how you can participate in the change that we are going to need so desperately. So again, I invite you to join us at the Undesigned exhibit. You can walk through any time that Trade Tech is open, and that's days of the week. Friday, I think they close a little bit early. We do offer some tours, guided tours to go through the exhibit. You can reach out, you make those arrangements, but you really don't have to have a formalized tour to get a good understanding of what the project is all about. We also invite people to see it as a group, like I said before, so if you have a group of colleagues or you're on a board of some sort, we really encourage you to come through. If you have students, young people of any and all ages, you really can learn a lot from looking at the redlining exhibit. So again, I'm so glad to be here to hear Mr. Rothstein, Richard, speak again, and glad to see so many of you interested in being the change that we need in our society. Thank you so much.
Next up, I'd like to invite Mr. Alan Greenlee, the esteemed executive director of the Southern California Association of Nonprofit Housing. He's going to introduce Mr. Rothstein, Richard.
How's it going, everybody? You guys doing all right today?
Yeah.
All right. So my job is to introduce Richard Rothstein. Before I do that, I'm going to take introductor's privilege and again thank LA Trade Tech for hosting this event as well as the Undesigning Redlining exhibit. Enterprise Community Partners for participating with us in this project. And so we are very proud to participate in this activity. Richard has served in many capacities, but one of those is a senior fellow at the Haas Institute at the University of California's Berkeley School of Law, and as a distinguished fellow at the Economic Policy Institute, where he works on policy issues regarding education and race, as well as a senior fellow emeritus at the Thurgood Marshall Institute of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. That is just the surface of an extensive and very august biography. Today, as you know, he's going to talk to us today about the color of law, and I'm just going to share with you a personal story. In the late 80s, I was a young, new staff person on Capitol Hill. And I was introduced to a piece of legislation that my boss, a senator from Texas named Lloyd Benson, was introducing to capture data about where home mortgage loans were being made. And I was introduced for the very first time to redlining. And we were going to pass what was called the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which in my mind was a serious and significant step forward in understanding where money really went. And as a result, with that data, we could understand what it meant to people of color and people who are not of And I think I'm very proud of that work. It's made a tremendous step forward. But not until last year when I read this book did I realize that that work, while important, was really only a really, really small part of the problem. So I'm excited today to have the opportunity to introduce to you Mr. Richard Rothstein.
Thank you very much, and thanks all of you for coming here this afternoon to engage in this discussion with me. As you all know, in the 20th century we had a civil rights movement in this country. It began in the 1930s with lawyers who challenged racial segregation in law schools, because they figured if judges couldn't understand anything else, they might be able to figure out that you couldn't get a good legal education in a segregated law school. And then that precedent was used to challenge racial segregation in colleges and universities. Those successes built towards something with which you're all familiar with, the Brown versus Board of Education decision that abolished legal segregation in elementary and secondary schools. The Brown decision then gave impetus to a growing civil rights movement that engaged not just in litigation, not even just in legislation, but in marches and demonstrations and civil disobedience. People lost their lives. And by the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement had abolished segregation in buses. You know the Rosa Parks story. Lunch counters, you perhaps know about the Greensboro sit-ins, public transportation of all kinds, public accommodations, water fountains, swimming pools, they all were segregated, and the civil rights movement abolished that. But at the end of the 1960s, the civil rights movement folded up its tent, went home, left untouched the biggest segregation of all, which is that every metropolitan area in this country is residentially segregated. I've lived in many of them, actually, and every one that I've lived in has had clearly defined areas that were white, or almost all white, clearly defined areas that were African American or all African American. How could it be that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? The civil rights movement, and indeed the country as a whole, not everybody, but a significant and a persuasive part of it, understood that racial segregation was wrong, that it was harmful to both blacks and to whites, that it was immoral, that it was incompatible with our self-conception as a democracy of equals. How is it that we left untouched the biggest segregation of all? Of course, it's harder to desegregate neighborhoods than to desegregate water fountains. If we pass a law saying you can't segregate water fountains anymore, the next day you can drink out of any water fountain. But if we pass a law saying that racial segregation can no longer exist, the next day things will look much different. And so because it's harder, what we've all done, and I mean all of us, blacks and whites, liberals, conservatives, northerners and southerners, Democrats and Republicans, all of us, have adopted a rationalization to avoid continuing what we know we should continue, and that is the attack on racial segregation, which expresses itself more forcefully than anywhere else in neighborhood segregation. And the rationalization that we've adopted, the excuse that we give ourselves, is something like this. We say to ourselves, well, all those other forms of segregation, of schools, of lunch counters, of buses, those were required by ordinance, by law, by government regulation, by public policy. As such, they violated the Constitution. If the government requires segregation, it violates the Constitution. If the federal government is doing it, it's a Fifth Amendment violation. If state and local governments are doing it, it's a 14th Amendment violation. It's a civil rights violation. And if you have a civil rights violation, obviously, if you take the Constitution seriously, we've got to remedy it. But we say to ourselves, all of us, residential segregation is somehow different. Residential segregation wasn't created by law by public policy, by ordinance, by regulation. Residential segregation, we say, just happened. It happened, because bigoted white homeowners wouldn't sell homes to African Americans in white neighborhoods. Or banks, real estate agents, private actors in the private economy discriminated in the way they did their work. Or maybe we tell ourselves that African Americans and whites just like to live with each other, the same race. Or maybe we say it's economic. On average, not everyone, but on average, African Americans have lower incomes than whites, and so they just can't afford to live in white middle-class neighborhoods. All of these individual, private, prejudicial maybe, but private decisions, economic forces, all of these is what's created residential segregation. We've given a name to it. We say what we have, and all of us use this term. We have de facto segregation. Everybody's heard that. Segregation that just happened in fact, not in law. And if it's not a violation of the Constitution, if it wasn't done by government, if it's not a violation of the 5th and 14th Amendment, well, it's too bad. Nobody likes it. But we're under no obligation to do anything about it. And so we've allowed, all of us, allowed ourselves to go on for the last 50, 60 years after the end of the Civil Rights. We've been tolerating the biggest segregation of all that creates some of the biggest social problems that we have. I began this work because I didn't know much about it before about 10 years ago. I was a student of education policy. I wrote a lot of articles about education policy. I spent a lot of my time attacking the dominant education policy in the country at that time. And at that time, some of you will remember, we had a national education policy that said that the only reason there was an achievement gap between African American and white children, where on average African American children scored lower in achievement measures than white children did, was because teachers had low expectations. They didn't try hard enough. And we actually passed a law that said that if only teachers tried harder, the achievement gap between black and white children would disappear. We called it the No Child Left Behind law. And we said that if we only tested children more and held teachers accountable for those test scores, the achievement gap would disappear. And I wrote many, many articles attacking that view. I thought it was nonsense. And I won't go into, spend a lot of time on it now. That would be a different lecture. Maybe you can come back tomorrow and I'll do that one. But I'll give you just one example. I remember writing a column once about describing the fact that in urban neighborhoods, low-income African-American children have asthma at 4 times the rate of white middle-class children. If a child has asthma, because of the pollution in the neighborhood or deteriorating buildings, vermin in the neighborhood, that child may very well be up at night wheezing, sleepless the next day, drowsy the next day, sometimes absent from school because of it. And I tried to explain in this writing, you may think this is obvious, but we had a law, a federal law that said that this was wrong. What I'm about to tell you, I tried to explain that if you have 2 groups of children who are equal in every respect, 2 identical groups of children, same racial makeup, same socioeconomic background, same family structure, same in every way except one group of children had a higher rate of asthma than the other, that group is going to have lower average achievement. It's not that some children with asthma aren't going to have higher achievement than typical children without, because there's a distribution of outcomes for every human characteristic. But on average, children who come to school sleepless, drowsy, are going to have lower average achievement than children who come to school well rested. I thought this was obvious. And I went through example after example of the conditions that children experience from disadvantaged families, whether it's asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity, stress, and explained that this is what causes the achievement gap, not teacher low expectations. No matter how high a teacher's expectations are, no matter how often you test the child, you can't make a child wide awake if the child hasn't been sleeping at night. So that's how I came to this, and I began to realize, because You know, you may be surprised, you know, I'm an old man, it took me a long time to realize this. Hopefully some of you will realize it much earlier, but I began to realize that if you have a school where every single child is either suffering from asthma or lead poisoning or homelessness or economic insecurity or stress, that school can't possibly have the same average achievement as a school where children come to school well-rested, economically secure, in stable homes. So that's what I was thinking about. And of course we call schools where we concentrate children like that, segregated schools. And the reality is that segregated schools are segregated today more than they have been at any time in the last 45 years. And the reason they're segregated is because the neighborhoods in which they're located are segregated. So I was thinking about all of this, and as an education analyst, not knowing anything about housing policy, and then I read a Supreme Court decision in 2007 about education. That's what I was interested in. And it was a Supreme Court decision in which the Supreme Court examined a desegregation program of 2 school districts, Louisville, Kentucky, and Seattle, Washington. Both of those districts had a very, very token school desegregation plan. They gave parents the choice of which school in the district their child would attend, but if the child's choice was going to exacerbate racial segregation, that choice wouldn't be honored in favor of the choice of a child that would help to ameliorate the segregated status of the school. So if you had a mostly white school and there was one place left, and both a black and a white child applied for that last place, the black child would be given some preference to help to diversify the school. Very token program. How many times do you have one place left in the school and both a black and a white child apply for it? You can't imagine a more token program to desegregate. But the Supreme Court denounced it, said it was unconstitutional. Chief Justice John Roberts wrote the opinion. He said that the schools in Louisville and Seattle were segregated because the neighborhoods in which they're located were segregated. Yeah, I thought that was a pretty wise observation on the Chief Justice's part. That is, in fact, why the schools in Louisville and Seattle are segregated. But then he went on to say that the neighborhoods in those cities are segregated for the reasons I just described. Private prejudice, actors in the private economy, people wanting to live with each other of the same race, economic differences. He said it was de facto segregation. And if you have de facto segregation, you're not permitted to do anything about it. It has to unhappen as naturally as it happened. Well, I read this decision and I remembered a case some years before in Louisville, Kentucky, one of the cities that this decision covered. In Louisville, Kentucky, there was a white homeowner in a single-family home in an all-white suburb of Louisville called Shively. He had an African-American friend who was renting an apartment in the center city of Louisville. The African-American friend was a decorated Navy veteran. He had a wife and child, a middle-class job, could afford a single-family home, but nobody would sell him one. Private bigotry, like the Chief Justice thought. So when the white homeowner, the friend of the African-American Navy veteran, decided to buy a second home in his suburb of Shively and resell it to his African-American friend. And when the African-American family moved in to this suburb of Shively, an angry white mob surrounded the home, protected by the police. The mob threw rocks through the windows. Somehow the police couldn't identify a single perpetrator. They firebombed and dynamited the home, and not a single perpetrator could be identified with the police. But when this riot was all over, the state of Kentucky arrested, tried, convicted, and jailed the white homeowner for sedition, for having sold a home in a white neighborhood to an African-American family. And I said to myself, this doesn't sound to me much like de facto segregation. If the police and the courts and the entire judicial system, the criminal justice system, is being used to enforce racial boundaries. So I began to wonder if the de facto myth was, or explanation was in fact a myth. And that's what led to this book that I'm going to talk to you about for a few minutes this afternoon. I found in the course of this investigation that the riot that took place in Shively was not unique. There was, and I'm not using these terms loosely, in Los Angeles and hundreds of other places, there were thousands of incidents of mob violence protected by the police, not prosecuted, to drive African Americans out of homes they had bought in what had previously been all white neighborhoods. This was a blatant 14th Amendment violation, the use of the police to enforce racial boundaries, but it went further than that. There was a whole network of federal, state, and local policies that created, reinforced, and maintained racial segregation on a racially explicit basis. I'm going to describe some of those policies to you, but my conclusion, and the conclusion that I expressed in this book, is that de facto segregation is an utter myth, no reality to it whatsoever. We have an unconstitutional system of racial boundaries in this country. Every segregated neighborhood is a civil rights violation because it was created by explicit racial policy by government. And as such, we, all of us, have an obligation as American citizens to remedy it. Well, let me describe some of the key programs that the federal government followed. There were many others at the state and local level, in addition to the use of the police, to create, enforce, sustain racial segregation. One that I'll begin with is public housing, something that we all misunderstand. We think public housing is a place where poor people live, lots of single mothers with children, lots of young men without jobs in the formal economy, lots of confrontations between those young men and the police, deteriorated buildings for the most part, dirt, not grass, play areas not maintained. That's our image of public housing. That's not how public housing began in this country. Public housing began in this country during the New Deal, in the Depression, by the Roosevelt administration, as a program for working middle-class families. There was a lot of unemployment in the Depression. 25% of the workforce was unemployed, but 75% had jobs. The public housing was for the 75% who had jobs, stable jobs, good employment histories, adequate furniture to be able to maintain high standards in public housing. It was created because no construction was being done in the Depression. So these people could afford to rent housing, but there was no housing available for them. And everywhere that the federal government built this housing during the Depression, it segregated it, creating separate projects for African Americans and whites, frequently, not always, but frequently, creating segregation in communities that hadn't previously known segregation. Because at that time in this country, there were many, many more urban integrated neighborhoods than we know today. Integration was a commonplace thing in urban neighborhoods in the mid-early 20th century. Not universal, but common, for the simple reason that we were mostly a manufacturing economy. Most of the employment was in factories or in warehouses serving those factories or other industries serving those factories. And the factories had to be located either near a deep water port or a railroad terminal because that's how they got their parts and shipped their final products. The workers of in these factory districts, if they were Irish or Jewish or Latino or African American, Italian, all had to live close enough to these downtown workplace centers, factory districts, to be able to walk to work. They didn't have automobiles. So you had a lot of integrated neighborhoods in urban areas in this country today. The great African American poet, novelist, playwright, I'm sure many of you are familiar with him, Langston Hughes, wrote in his autobiography how he grew up in an integrated downtown Cleveland neighborhood. We don't think of downtown Cleveland today as being an integrated place, but he said his best friend in high school was Polish. He dated a Jewish girl. I'm not suggesting that this was everyday experience for every high school student, but it wasn't unique or as unique as it is today in downtown urban neighborhoods. The Public Works Administration, this first New Deal agency, went into this neighborhood of Cleveland that was an integrated neighborhood where Langston Hughes had grown up, demolished housing there to build two separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, creating a pattern of segregation in that neighborhood that hadn't previously existed. And with other similar segregated projects elsewhere in the Cleveland area, created, reinforced a pattern of segregation that exists to this day. In my book, The Color of Autos, some of you may have read it, I like to pick on places that are smug, self-satisfied, think they're better than the rest of us. So I talk about Cambridge, Massachusetts. Some of you may have heard of that place. It's The area between Harvard and MIT, the Central Square neighborhood, was like that downtown area of Cleveland, an integrated neighborhood. It was about half black and half white. The Public Works Administration segregated it with 2 separate projects, one for whites, one for African Americans, and with other projects in the Boston metropolitan area, created a pattern of segregation there that persists to this day. During World War II, hundreds of thousands of workers flocked to centers of defense production to take jobs in war industries, jobs that hadn't been available during the Depression prior to the war. They overwhelmed the places where they came to work. The growth of employment was so rapid that housing didn't exist for the workers who migrated from the South or the Midwest or the Western states. If the government wanted the ships and the tanks and the airplanes and the jeeps to be produced, it had to create housing for these workers. And so it did. And the West Coast here is a particularly good example of this. In Northern California, another place I can pick on, Berkeley, had a suburb just north of it called Richmond, which was the center of shipbuilding on the West Coast. It was a small community, 20,000, all white, at the beginning of the war, no shipbuilding being done there. By the end of the war, there were 100,000 workers in the shipyards of Richmond, California. Historians like to divide the migration of African Americans to northern and western cities into 2 big migrations. The first great migration took place around World War I for the similar reasons, to work in war plants. The second great migration took place around World War II. Very few African Americans came to the West Coast in the first great migration. There was a small African American population here and up and down the coast, but not significantly large. It was only the second great migration that brought large numbers of African Americans here to take jobs in war industries. So we can confidently say that if the government was going to build housing for these war workers, if it built segregated housing, it was creating a pattern that was not in any way existent before. It was the primary initial cause of segregation on the West Coast, and that's in fact what the government did. In Richmond and in Berkeley and down into Oakland, just south of Berkeley, on the other side from Richmond, the government built shoddy housing, temporary housing for the African American war workers along the railroad tracks in the industrial area. The city of Richmond announced it didn't have to build permanent housing for the black workers because they would have to leave at the end of the war. But for white workers, it built more stable housing in the residential areas east of the industrial area, creating a pattern of segregation that otherwise we can confidently say would not have existed. There was no incipient informal segregation on the West Coast, and that's how we got segregation in places like Portland, Seattle, the San Francisco Bay Area, and here in Los Angeles. The government actually decided that Watts was going to be the African American neighborhood. It proposed housing for war workers in Venice, for example, near the Santa Monica Airport, which is where the Douglas aircraft was being built. But when white residents objected, it decided it would put all public housing for war workers in Watts, and that's how Watts became a black neighborhood, was with war worker housing during World War II. After the war, there was still an enormous housing shortage. In addition to the fact that there was no housing being built during the Depression except for the few projects that I mentioned, like in Cleveland and Cambridge. And, during the war, it was actually illegal to use construction materials for civilian purposes unless it was for workers at war plants. And then millions of returning war veterans were coming back to this country, needing housing, needing a place to create the baby boom. And the government had to respond to this housing crisis. The returning war veterans were living in open fields and Quonset huts, and doubled, tripled up with relatives. It was an enormous crisis. President Truman, who succeeded Roosevelt at the end of the war, proposed a vast expansion of the national public housing program. Not again for poor people. These were returning war veterans who had jobs in the post-war boom, but no housing had been built. Public housing was not yet for poor people. The story I'm going to tell you now, for those of you who are involved in low-income housing, is probably the most important story I'm going to tell you this afternoon, and I hope you'll think carefully about its implications. Conservatives in Congress wanted to defeat Truman's public housing program. Had nothing to do with race, it was segregated, they didn't care about that. It's not that they didn't like poor people, public housing wasn't for poor people, it was for returning war veterans who had jobs. They wanted to defeat it because they thought public housing was socialistic, and the private sector should be taking care of the housing needs of returning war veterans. So they came up with a strategy that we refer to as a poison pill strategy. Some of you may have heard that term. Yes, a few nods, okay. Poison pill strategy is where opponents of a bill in Congress come up with an amendment to the bill which they think they can get passed. But they understand that if that amendment is passed, it will make the entire bill unpalatable to a different majority and the bill will go down to defeat. So conservatives in Congress proposed an amendment to the 1949 Housing Act as follows. From now on, public housing has to be integrated. No more segregated public housing. No more racial discrimination in public housing. It was a cynical proposal. They didn't want public housing at all, but they planned to vote for the integration amendment. They figured they could get some northern liberals to join with them. That would create a majority. So the amendment would be passed, and then when the full 1949 Housing Act came up before Congress as a program that required non-discrimination, the conservatives would flip and vote against the final bill. They would be joined by Southern Democrats who didn't want integrated housing but were happy with segregated housing, and the entire bill would go down to defeat. So Northern liberals faced a dilemma, a very terrible dilemma. They had an enormous housing crisis that they needed to solve, lots of homelessness. They wanted to build more public housing. If they supported the integration amendment, no housing would be built, because if the integration amendment passed, the entire housing bill would go down to defeat. The only way they could get housing built was by defeating the integration amendment and getting public housing continued as a segregated program. What were they going to do? Were they going to make a devil's bargain and support segregation in order to get affordable housing? Or were they going to stick up for their principles and insist on integration, understanding that no housing would be built? The leading liberal in the Senate at that time was a senator from Illinois. His name was Paul Douglas. He was joined by his closest colleague, a senator from Minnesota, Hubert Humphrey, known as Mr. Civil Rights. They campaigned against the integration amendment. Senator Douglas got up on the floor of the Senate and he made a speech along the following lines. He said, "I want to say to my Negro friends that you'll be better off if the integration amendment is defeated and you get housing on a segregated basis than you will be if the integration amendment is passed and you get no housing at all." Well, Douglas succeeded in persuading liberals to vote against the integration amendment. It was defeated. The full housing bill then came up on the floor of the House and Senate, and it was passed as a program that continued segregation in public housing. The federal government then used that vote as its justification for continuing to segregate all federal housing programs, not just public housing. I'll come back to this later, but we face the same dilemma today. It is easier to build affordable housing in already segregated neighborhoods, reinforcing their segregation. We will get less affordable housing if we insist on building it on an integrated basis. But the price we pay for that Douglas devil's bargain is not only the achievement gap that I described earlier. It's in schools, by segregating the most disadvantaged children in single neighborhoods. It's health disparities. African Americans living in areas of concentrated poverty have shorter life expectancies, higher rates of heart disease, because they live in less healthy neighborhoods. It predicts the kind of unacceptable mass incarceration, confrontations between young men and police in segregated neighborhoods that couldn't exist if we weren't concentrating the most disadvantaged young men in single neighborhoods without access to jobs in the formal economy. It also predicts, I think, the very dangerous political polarization that we have in this country today. Very dangerous. It's not entirely racial, but it tracks racial lines. And how can we ever ever expect to preserve our existence as a democracy if so many African Americans and whites live so far from each other that they have no ability to develop a mutual understanding and empathy and a common national identity. So these are the consequences of the devil's bargain that Douglass made, because under that 1949 Housing Act, the vast expansion of public housing across the country took place. Far more public housing built after 1949 than had ever been known before. Very soon after that, something happened in public housing that was unexpected. The white projects developed large numbers of vacancies. The black projects had long waiting lists. Pretty soon, it became so conspicuous that even the most bigoted public housing official couldn't justify a situation where some of the projects in the city were virtually empty and others had long waiting lists. So all of the projects were opened up in the 1940s and 50s to African Americans. Pretty soon, at the same time, the industry left the cities that I was talking about before. They no longer needed to be located near deep water ports or railroad terminals because highways were being built. They could get their parts and ship their final products by truck. As the jobs disappeared, the people living in public housing became poorer and poorer with less access to good jobs. Public housing came to be subsidized in large numbers for the first time. Once it became subsidized, government stopped investing, maintaining it. It began to deteriorate, and we got the kind of public slums that we identify with public housing today. But it didn't begin that way. Well, as the final example I want to give you, let me explain, for those of you who haven't read my book, why all those vacancies developed in the white projects and not in the black projects. These were all returning war veterans who had jobs in the post-war economy. Why was there such a difference in the need for public housing between the races? This was because of another federal program that was even more powerful in creating a segregated country than public housing. And that was a program of the Federal Housing Administration that was explicitly, racially explicitly designed to move the entire white working class population out of cities into single family homes in all white suburbs. I want to emphasize it was explicit. This was not the unintended consequence of a benign housing program. This was an explicit policy of the Federal Housing Administration to move white families out of cities into suburban areas. Under this program, the entire country was suburbanized on a racial basis. And you're familiar with many of these suburbs that were created in this time. Los Angeles, in fact, became the symbol of suburbanization in the country. I was talking before about Westchester. When Kaiser closed his shipyards in Richmond, he went into the housing building business and built an FHA subsidized whites-only project in Westchester. Panorama City, Lakewood now, down near the McDonnell Douglas plant. All of these were federally subsidized projects. The most famous from the East Coast is Levittown, east of New York City. Some of you may recall hearing a song that Pete Seeger used to sing. It was written by Malvina Reynolds about little boxes on a hillside made of ticky-tacky, and they all look the same. That was about an FHA all-white suburb created south of San Francisco. So between San Francisco and Los Angeles and Levittown on the East Coast, there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these suburbs built around every city in the country. A builder like Kaiser or Henry Dolger, who built the little boxes on the hillside, or William Levitt. This was 17,000 homes in Levittown. The little boxes were 15,000 homes. Remember, this is a time when we were not a suburban nation yet. Nobody knew whether anybody would be interested in buying homes out in the suburbs, in these giant subdivisions. No bank would be crazy enough to lend Levitt or Dolger or Kaiser the money they needed to build these giant developments, to buy the land. The only way that Levitt or Dolger or Kaiser or any of the others, Mark Taper, builders at the time, the only way they could get the money to build these developments was by going to the Federal Housing Administration, submitting their plans for the development, asking the Federal Housing Administration to guarantee their bank loans. The Federal Housing Administration agreed to do it on condition that the developers agreed never to sell a home to an African American, The Federal Housing Administration even required that a clause be placed in the deed of every home in these developments prohibiting resale to African Americans or rental to African Americans, and these deeds still exist in these, even though they're not enforced anymore, they still exist in these subdivisions today. This was not the action of rogue bureaucrats. It was an explicit policy. It was written in the FHA's manual, which went out to every appraiser in the country whose job it was to evaluate the application of developers for these loans, loan guarantees. The manual said that you couldn't approve a loan guarantee, a federal loan guarantee for an integrated development. The manual went so far as to say that you couldn't even approve a guarantee for a bank loan for an all-white development if it was located near where African Americans were living, because in the words of the manual, and I'm quoting, that would run the risk of infiltration by inharmonious racial groups. That's what the federal manual said. Where did this notion of de facto segregation come from? It's nonsense. This is as explicit a racial program as any that we abolished in the 20th century, and yet we've all ignored it. The consequences of these policies have been enormous. Consequences have been enormous. Think about these subdivisions I just talked about. In the mid-20th century, they were small, modest homes, 750 square feet typically. They sold for about $8,000, $9,000, $10,000. $8,000, $9,000, $10,000. In today's money, inflation adjusted, it's something around $100,000, twice national median income. If you were a returning war veteran, as many of the home buyers were, no down payment was required with a VA mortgage. Any working class family can afford a home with a 30-year mortgage and no down payment required that sells for twice national median income. Today, those $100,000 homes no longer sell for $100,000. They now sell for, depending on the part of the country, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000, sometimes much more. The white families who bought those homes on a racially explicit program of the Federal Housing Administration gained over the next few generations wealth from the appreciation and the value of their homes. $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 in wealth. African Americans who were prohibited from participating in this wealth generating exercise continued to rent in urban areas, either in public housing or in the private market. They gained none of this wealth. The result is that today, let me say that the wealth that the families who participated in this program got was used to send their children to college. It was used to take care of emergencies, whether it was medical emergencies or temporary unemployment. You can weather temporary unemployment if you have wealth. If you don't have wealth and you lose a job, you're pushed down permanently in the economic ladder. They used it to finance their retirements, and they used it to bequeath wealth to their children and grandchildren, who then had down payments for their own homes. African Americans, as I said, were prohibited from participating in this wealth generating exercise. The result is today, African American incomes on average are about 60%, 60% of white incomes. There's another story behind that difference. That's probably a third lecture. You can come back 2 days from now for that one. But, 60% of white incomes. You would think that a 60% income ratio would turn into a 60% wealth ratio. But in fact, while African American incomes are 60% of white incomes, African American wealth is only 10% of white wealth. And that enormous disparity, which on top of all of the other problems I described about, the achievement gap, health gaps, criminal justice, political polarization, that enormous disparity in wealth, which predicts so many of the social problems that we have in this country today, is attributable entirely to unconstitutional federal housing policy that was practiced in the mid-20th century and that we've never remedied. The remedies for this segregation that we have created are easy to develop. They're not hard. It's easy to think about what they could be. Some of you were involved in the low-income housing tax credit program. The Federal Treasury Department issues those tax credits, places a premium on placing low-income housing tax credit developments in already low-income neighborhoods. It's an easy regulation to change if we wanted to do it. It's not that we shouldn't be building some housing in those neighborhoods, of course we should. But we should also be building it in high opportunity places to help to desegregate this country. In the same way the Section 8 voucher program is used primarily to reinforce segregation, because most Section 8 voucher holders can't find housing, can't find places to use their vouchers outside already low-income segregated neighborhoods. We have zoning laws, which I think are unconstitutional, that prohibit the construction of townhouses or single-family homes, even on small lot sizes, or apartments in single-family home neighborhoods that were created as all-white bastions under an unconstitutional policy. The zoning ordinances perpetuate that unconstitutional situation. We should be subsidizing the purchase of homes by middle and working class African Americans who could have afforded homes if they had been permitted to buy them generations ago, but now nobody can afford, no working class family can afford to buy those homes. We should be subsidizing. It's an affirmative action program to remedy past discrimination. So the policies are easy to develop. What's hard is developing the political will to do so. And that will require a new civil rights movement. Not just lawyers, not just policymakers like many of you. It will require the kind of direct action and mass action, grassroots action that previous civil rights movements engaged in, to demand a remedy to this enduring legacy of slavery and of an unconstitutional system of residential boundaries. I hope that you'll all join that civil rights movement when it develops, and indeed will help to develop it, because unless we develop a new mass demand for remedies, easy though they are to design, it won't happen. So thank you very much, and I guess we're going to take some questions now, discussion.
All right, so before we do the conversation between Jacqueline Wagner and Richard, a couple things. We're going to ask you to multitask here. Some of you asked for question cards. If you have a question card that we'll try to get to, please hold them up, and Keegan back here will get them. Those of you who has bought a book today from Roman's Bookstore, Southern California's oldest and largest privately owned bookstore? Excellent. Who wants to win a free one? So Scamp and Enterprise. So we have bought 5 books that have been signed by Richard, and so Alan, can I get you up here to?
Was it time now?
Yes, it is. And then, if we call your name, please stand up, and Cherish from Enterprise will hand you the book. This is mine.
So they're signed, right?
They're already signed.
They're already signed.
So you don't have to wait.
So there's only 4. Or maybe there's 5.
No, there's 5. I bought one. It's not signed.
All right. And the winner is of book number 1.
Let's do fast.
Okay. Go here.
Whoa. Suzanne Caesar.
Suzanne Caesar.
All right.
Heather Kerrigan. Katie Oren.
Wow.
Look at Katie. Is that it? 1, 2, 3. And, oh, wow.
I know, right?
Keandra Kyler Dodds.
Oh, 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, we got one more.
One more.
2 more.
2 more.
Oh,
You got to be present to win.
gotta be president.
All right. Michelle Helm. Loser. Sandra McNeil. Where's Sandra McNeil? There she is. Yay! All right, one more. LaCheryl Porter. 4, 3, 2, 1.
Yep.
One more. Dang, we're gonna do this forever.
All right.
Donald Byers.
All right.
Yeah.
So a quick introduction. We've heard Richard speak. Jacqueline Wagner, who's sitting to his right, needs no introduction. If you've been in affordable housing, community development, capital solutions here in Los Angeles and Southern California, you have run across her. I could go through her extensive list of participation and accomplishments. Just a few, she is Commissioner Wagner from LASA. She's the co-chair of the ad hoc committee on Black people experiencing homelessness. She's a SCAMF board member. I could keep going on, but we'll keep it there. Yeah, that's enough. Okay. So she will be asking questions, and again, if you, we're trying to keep this in a controlled setting. If you want to write down a question, hold it up, and we'll try to get it to her. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon. I hope everyone is good on coffee and cookies, because we're going to have a very deep conversation with Richard. You know, you summarizing the intentionality behind all of these government practices that have led to racial and geographic segregation is really disturbing. I read your book last year. I've done the audio listening. And I'm still floored every time I hear it, because it's so silent in our history around the country. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to about redlining in the past couple of months as we were bringing the exhibit, and people really don't even know what it is. And that's the reason why we wanted to bring Richard here today to talk about the color of law. But there's another reason why we have the exhibit here. A lot of things that Richard touched on are actually in the exhibit. Some of these policies and practices. And besides the policies and practice, I actually want to get down to the nitty gritty. Besides like subsidy on home ownership, building affordable housing, you almost went as far to say reparations. And I want to know kind of what, I mean, we're talking, there are some subsidy housing programs, there's affordable housing being built, there's a push to find housing opportunities in high-income areas. I know we have someone that develops in the city of Santa Monica, affordable housing, we have Tara here. And I'm just thinking, what else could we be doing? Because the gaps, the wealth gaps are so big. It would take multiple generations for African Americans to get where their white counterparts are. So I just wanted to know, go a little bit deeper on what you think those solutions look like, because we're actually talking about money here.
Well, I don't use the term reparations because most people, doesn't have to be this way, but most people think of it as a single one-time payment to African Americans, which would never be great enough to take care of this problem. And people would think that, well, we've taken care of it now. It's done. We've made reparations. I use the term remedies, which is, I think, is a much broader term than reparations. It includes some things that would be costly. I described one of them before, that if we had the political will, the government should be buying up homes in places like the ones I mentioned, Westchester, Panorama City, up in, Westlake in San Francisco, Levittown, at current market prices, and reselling them to qualified working and lower middle class African Americans for $100,000. That would be a narrowly targeted constitutional remedy for a very specific constitutional violation. It would be costly. But there are many things that we should be doing that wouldn't cost a penny and that reparations don't cover. We should be, as I indicated, we should be prohibiting zoning rules that require only single-family homes and large lot sizes, so that some of you can begin to build and finance affordable housing in suburbs where it's now not permitted. The city of Minneapolis, you're probably aware of this, they just passed an ordinance prohibiting single-family zoning throughout the entire city. It's a small step. It only permitted 3 units on existing lot sizes, but it's a step forward. And so there are many things, like I say, we could change and know that here in Los Angeles you don't even have a source of income anti-discrimination requirement for Section 8 voucher holders. So landlords are permitted to refuse to accept Section 8 voucher holders just because they have a Section 8 voucher for no other reason. That wouldn't be a cost. That wouldn't cost anything, but it would be a very important step forward in the right direction. So we need to be creative about thinking about many policies that we should be implementing. No single one of them will make all the difference, and all of them won't make all the difference in a very short period of time. But we can start to be moving in a different direction than we've moved in this country in the past.
Yeah, I feel like we have to start somewhere. One of the things I want to share with you is LA County Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas and LA County Supervisor Sheila Kuehl just helped pass the Fair Housing Act to stop the discrimination of Section 8 holders. So we're super excited about that, and we're going to follow that, and hopefully there's some strong enforcement behind it so that we can ensure that it's actually not happening.
So my information is out of date.
It's recent. It's very recent. It's just in recent weeks. The other thing that comes across to me is that I know reparations is a tough word for people to absorb, but really what we're talking about is really solutions. And I think that people need to think about the greater good, like when we don't help people. Like you've heard a couple of times about the ad hoc committee on Black people experiencing homelessness. And it's actually a result of these practices, right? And so we're trying to solve homelessness. There's 50,000+ people experiencing homelessness. And if we don't get upstream and start coming up with some of these solutions where people have the opportunity to make a living wage, have good housing, better education, we're going to continue to flood the streets with Angelinos that just can't afford to live here. And I wanted to ask you, there have been some things that have happened. 50 years ago, we had the Fair Housing Act. And I'd like to get your thoughts on, like, how do you think that's been helpful, or is that platform worked? We just crossed the 50th anniversary. I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I don't actually think we've crossed the 50th anniversary because the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, but enforcement provisions weren't added until 1988. So really, it's only the 30th anniversary of the meeting.
That's fair.
But the Fair Housing Act has been important. It's made some progress, but it's inadequate to solve this problem. And let me put it in terms of the example I was using. The Fair Housing Act said, okay, African Americans, you're now allowed to buy homes in Levittown or in Panorama City. It's okay. You can no longer be prohibited. But those homes are unaffordable for working class families today. So the Fair Housing Act is inadequate to solve that problem. It's made some progress. Levittown, for example, I happen to know about it, is in an area that's probably 15% African American. Levittown now, as a result of the Fair Housing Act, has a 3% African American population. So the difference between that 3% and what you would expect if we had non-discriminatory policy, something coming closer to approaching 15%, is what's left undone by the Fair Housing Act.
This was a nationwide policy, redlining. Can you describe a little bit why you chose the cities that you did to write about?
Well, can I say something else first about redlining?
Sure.
I want to explain because it's used in a very loose way. The maps that you see were drawn by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and what they did was they indicated, as you heard before, Mary Lee described it, that they indicated where it was too risky for the federal government to insure mortgages. So these were low-income segregated neighborhoods. We've come to use the term redlining in a much broader way, so that the program that I talked about, where the federal government refused to insure developments and mortgages in high-income neighborhoods, it's not technically redlining. So the term redlining is being used in a much broader way than it actually was developed. Redlining, and it was a very important contributor to this, is it helped to deteriorate existing African American neighborhoods. The other policies, which were equally, perhaps even more important, excluded African Americans from other neighborhoods. And although we use the term redlining for that, it's not really the case. How did I pick the cities to use? Oh, I don't know. I have, you know, you write a book like this, and I don't know if any of you have ever done history research, but I probably have notes that are about 4 or 5 times the length of what actually went in the book. I went through my notes and picked examples from here or there to demonstrate that it was a national problem. So I chose Richmond because I wanted to have an example of an individual that I could trace through the book to show how it actually operated in a particular family's life. And Levittown because I was able to trace the life of another family. And then I picked examples from elsewhere to demonstrate that this was not a Southern problem, that it was a national problem, and that it existed in many, many forms. I don't even remember what I included in the book and what I didn't. Did I talk about Culver City in the book?
You do.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So some of the things that we've noticed, and Mary knows this much better than I do, but a lot of the places where redlining is happening is the same places where we see gentrification and displacement. Is that true in other parts of the country as well?
Sure. Gentrification is a big problem. I'm surprised you waited until your 4th question. It's usually the first question I get. It's a big problem in places like Los Angeles and San Francisco and Oakland and New York, and Austin, and you can go on and on about it. Gentrification. You know, every community in the country should be gentrified. It should have a mix of low, moderate, and low-income housing. And gentrification has the potential for creating pockets of integration. The problem is that we're not regulating it, so that will happen. And what is happening in most places of the country without regulation is that gentrification is converting low-income segregated neighborhoods into high-income white segregated neighborhoods. And but again, the policies to control it aren't easy to develop. It's not that we don't know what we do. Rent control. California actually has something that other cities in the country don't have, and that is, many places in the country, one of the biggest harms that gentrification is doing is that longtime homeowners are being forced out of their homes because they can no longer pay the property taxes on their homes. That doesn't happen in California because of Prop 13. Prop 13 has another problem, but it's not this one. And that is it starves schools and other public facilities for the funds they need. That would be an easy thing to fix, by the way. It's a different topic. But when I recommend around the country that they adopt property tax freezes like Prop 13 in order to enable low, moderate income homeowners, African American homeowners in existing neighborhoods to keep their homes when property values rise. The Commissioner of Internal Revenue proposed a very simple fix to the problem that California has, and that is that at point of sale, those lost property taxes be recouped. So Prop 13 could be modified to save the schools of California, which at one time were among the best in the country and now are among the worst because of Prop 13. But if you have a homeowner in Watts or some other low-income neighborhood in California who bought their home for $50,000 30 years ago, and now sells it for $1 million or whatever, instead of making a $950,000 profit, they pay back the property taxes they haven't paid, they only make $800,000 profit. That would be an easy fix to property tax freeze policy that would help to preserve the ability of people to remain. So I mentioned rent control, limits on condominium conversions, inclusionary zoning that requires any development in these communities to include a share of low income as well as moderate and market rate units. So we know what to do in order to prevent gentrification from flipping one form of segregation into another form. But even if we did those things, still some people would be displaced. There's no way to do both, to both have controlled gentrification and nobody get displaced. And we're doing nothing, although we know what the policies are to control gentrification. A lot of housing experts are talking about them, even though we're not doing anything about them. Nobody's talking about the people who are being displaced, who are being typically displaced to new, low-income, segregated neighborhoods that are even farther from jobs and opportunity than they were before. And so we need to address, as a way of addressing the problems of gentrification, not only preserving the right of many families to remain in the communities where they've lived in, but also preserve the right of people who leave to go to high opportunity places, not just in the low-income segregated neighborhoods.
I think we have many anti-displacement soldiers in the room. I'm one of them. Half the enterprise family is. But you talked about the devil's bargain, and NIMBYism is a huge issue here, right? And we have been trying to support housing in high opportunity areas and traditional low-income communities. And what do you think the solution is? Because the housing is still being driven into particular areas. Like, how do we change the narrative so people want all types of housing across the market? How do we change that tactic?
With the new civil rights movement. That's the only way to do it. That's the only way we change the narrative about segregated schools or segregated water fountains or segregated buses. It's the only way it changed, and that's the only way this can change.
And you think the civil rights movement ground up, like regional?
Yeah, I think so. Actually, there are a number of national civil rights leaders who are talking about creating a national committee to redress segregation in housing that will involve local committees as well. And anybody who's interested in being informed about that can give me their email address, and I'll put you on the list when it's announced.
Amen. All right, so we had a couple of questions. One, you asked about the gentrification playing a role, and then I think somebody wanted to hear more about the lending policies, and there were lending policies then that kept African Americans from owning, but do you think there are still some lending practices that are preventing people of color from owning assets?
Yes, there are. I'm not, I'm learning about all this stuff.
Yes,
I have to tell you.
Yeah.
As I said before, I was an education expert. I knew nothing about this. I wrote a book about history, and now everybody wants to know what we can do about it. We had to learn something about housing policy.
Yeah.
So I have heard that there's an excellent report by Reveal, the Center of Investigative Reporting, about ongoing discriminatory lending policies, the way in which credit scores are discriminatorily applied. For example, I'm not familiar with all the details about it, but you should go to the Center for Investigative Reporting website, look at this Reveal report that documents that.
Yeah, and I think about housing costs here in Los Angeles. If you don't have someone transferring wealth to you, and housing is north of $600,000, most people won't ever own. And so what are some of the alternatives as we start to think about how do we improve people's wealth gap without actually owning the property, owning a home? Or do you have other thoughts around that?
Well, let me say that the housing crisis in places like Los Angeles and San Francisco and other places like I mentioned is not just a racial problem. There's young white people can't afford homes either anymore when they have a typical middle-class job, middle-class family. So we need more housing. Increasing the supply of housing is not going to solve the problem entirely. But it's obviously got to be a simple supply and demand problem. If housing is too expensive, the most obvious way of trying to bring the price down is to build more housing, and that means abolishing exclusionary zoning policies. It means increasing density throughout the city. That's the only way to begin to bring these prices down so that they're affordable. And then, of course, we need to address, and this is not the subject of my book, but we need to address the economic policies on the income side. So if you bring the prices down, you also have to bring the incomes up. And we have enormous economic inequality in this country today, which is not exclusively a racial problem. It's partly driven by race. When I talked about the political polarization we have in this country that largely tracks racial lines, as you all know, I'm not telling you something you don't know. We have politicians who appeal to racist sentiment on the part of white voters and then create inequality that hurts the very voters who voted for them. So those problems have to be addressed. We need economic reform as well.
Yeah, and I think the challenge here in the region is real estate is so expensive, and as we say we want to build more, we always build where land is cheaper. And then we continue to perpetuate the problems that we're seeking to solve. And so I know Enterprise has done some work around looking at publicly owned parcels and other things. I really think that we need to get to business of being more intentional about that. I think the city's working on that, the county's working on that, so that's exciting. How are we doing on time?
20 minutes, 30 minutes?
All right, I have a couple of questions for you. Some of them long-winded. I'll try to abbreviate them. One says in the book, you mentioned redlining, perpetuation, proliferation of alcohol outlets in low-income communities, creating food deserts and nuisance. What can be done to intersect all of these issues, housing, food, access to green space, and health?
Well, I don't know what to say about that except to repeat what I said before, and that is we need to abolish exclusionary zoning that prohibits the construction of housing that people can afford in presently unaffordable neighborhoods. I don't think you can, the question referred to the fact that historically we have created deteriorated neighborhoods by zoning that permits non-residential and harmful uses in neighborhoods where African Americans predominated. Very frequently at a local level, these were racially motivated policies. But if the property values in those neighborhoods start to rise through controlled gentrification that permits people to stay, those uses will no longer be profitable.
We've asked a lot of questions. This is a very heavy conversation. I guess in addition to the civil rights movement, what gives you hope? Because it really provokes a lot of thinking, like what we should be doing. But like, what makes you hopeful?
Well, that is what makes me hopeful. I started doing this research a long time ago, as I said, in 2007. I wasn't planning to write a book about this because I thought nobody would be interested in it, but some of you are too young to remember, but at the time I started doing this, we were in a post-racial society. So this wasn't a book I was planning to write, and suddenly, things began to change in that regard. Particularly Ferguson was the first thing, and people suddenly became aware that we had a discriminatory criminal justice system. And Michelle Alexander wrote a book called The New Jim Crow. Matthew Desmond wrote a book called Evicted. Brian Stevenson wrote a book called Just Mercy. And so we began to have a national conversation, and I wrote this book, which also got stunning attention. We began to have a national conversation about race that is actually, I think, more accurate and passionate than any conversation about race we've ever had in American history. Again, some of you who are too young to remember this, but in the 1990s, President Clinton, who was probably more sophisticated about racial issues than any white politician in a country of recent memory, he said he was going to have a national conversation about race. This was in 1998. Do you remember that? Mm-hmm. National conversation about race? He talked to himself for about a week, and that was the end of the national conversation. But we're now having that national conversation. We have white elected politicians in the South demolishing and removing statues that commemorate slavery and the defenders of slavery. That was unheard of 5 years ago. And it's not just the Black Lives Matter. It's you know, it's that. It's say all the Ta-Nehisi Coates, one of the most popular authors, best-selling authors in the country. It's not being read just by African Americans. So I am hopeful that we've turned a corner so far as being able to have these conversations, being able to recognize that we've never dealt with the legacies of slavery. That we have this exhibit, Undesigning the Red Line. It's been going around the city after city. So what's needed is to convert this conversation into action.
Yes.
And that's, I think, the next step.
Yeah, we've been thinking out loud as we invited you here today, and we have the exhibit. It's like, what are we going to do, and how can people see themselves in the solution? And just starting to educate people about redlining, having the exhibit, to wake people up. Like, we didn't just get here overnight. This is hundreds of years in the making, and as the end result is this displacement, gentrification, or more people experiencing homelessness. I am about to wrap up, and I wanted to know if there's anything else you wanted to share.
No, I think I have plenty of airtime, and I thank you for your attention.
Yeah, and I want to tell you this book is very popular in the region. Everybody that's in the affordable housing sector or community advocates, everyone is well aware of the color of law. We read it as a staff, and we're so glad to have you here, and it's an honor. Thank you for coming.
Do you want to stand here? All right, everybody. So this concludes our program. Just want to do a little logistics and thank yous. As you might know, this takes a lot of, hey, thank you. This takes a lot of effort on behalf of a lot of people. I want to thank the SCAMP staff who really worked hard, the enterprise staff who worked really hard. We made sure you were fed. We made sure you didn't get lost between the exhibit at Magnolia Hall and back. So, so that was a key thing. We want to thank the Los Angeles Trade Technical College hosting us today. Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas for the support of his office. And also designing the We for creating the exhibit. And finally, support your local bookstores. They are dying and breed. And so buy books in person. Feel them. So I want to thank Romans as well. So with that, Richard is going to be standing up here at the podium. I promise to turn the mic off. We'll turn his mic off in case you ask some, there's some questions that you want to ask, so you'll get captured online. But thank you very much. And if you just want to line up here. Ooh, can I get you?
Approached me about marketing and policy. I want to talk to you about it. I don't know enough about policy. I know you know what I'm affiliated with, but I want to talk to you about it. I can't do it right now, but give me your contact information and I can.
guy?
Huh?
Are you the guy who's putting this up on YouTube?
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. Any way I could get that link or the channel that it would be on?
I said, who are you with?
University of Southern California. I'm a journalism student recovering. It would just be good if I could look back and pull out specific quotes, maybe.
Okay. What's your cell number?
Are you ready?
Yeah.
It's 518 330 8101.
Paste here. Paste there. Wrong spot. Let me know if you got it.
Okay, I will. Thank you. I got it. Thanks.
Okay.
That sounds